Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second series on our digital content marketing webinar mini-series. Today, our title is Get Started Podcasting. I am Will Jurgensen, the Director of Client Experience at Keystone Click. And with me, as always, owner, president of Keystone Click, Lori Hybe. Lori, how are you doing on this Friday afternoon?
Fantastic. Excited for the holiday weekend, even though it is definitely going to be different not being with friends and family over the Easter holiday.
That is for sure. There's no question about it. We hope everyone has a wonderful weekend nonetheless. So let's kind of quickly, Lori, go through our agenda today. A big thing that I'm sure people are asking themselves is how the heck do we even get start podcasting? So we want to make sure we dive deep into that. Why podcast in the first place? What equipment is needed in order to be successful at podcasting? Some tips for getting started. And then as always, we're going to kind of end our session with some Q&A.
So let's talk about just the background that Will and I have on podcasting. I started my podcast in 2017, and the backstory really actually goes back to 2015 when my very good friend Stephen Wessner asked me if I wanted to be a guest on his show, Onward Nation. I was definitely honored to be asked. However, I was just totally afraid of the whole experience. That whole imposter syndrome thing was definitely happening. Well, after some emails and phone calls, he kept, poking at me saying, you need to be on my show. Just do it. Well, I ended up caving and said, okay, fine, I'll be a guest on your show. And it was awesome. I had so much fun. And to the extent that I decided I want to do it on my own. So as of today, I have recorded over 230 episodes on my podcast. And I've been a guest on a number of different shows. I focus primarily on the purpose behind my podcast is thought leadership, having consistent content creation, and definitely I'm using it for a level of lead generation. So Will, let's talk about Sportcoats for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. Sportcoats just launched last week. Actually, it was very exciting. It was quite a process. This is incredibly fresh in my mind right now. So I'm glad that we decided to make this one a topic for our mini series because it is truly a process from kind of when that initial idea gets really fired up in your brain to the point where it's actually launched and released out to the public. So working at Keystone Click, we have an amazing podcasting room within our, in our office space. And that was certainly, so I'm fortunate in that sense because I was provided a lot of the resources right away. Not everyone is so lucky to have that, but it shouldn't deter anyone from continuing to try and strive to start their podcast. But I had a number of different ideas of what the heck it was that I wanted to do, and ultimately the message back to me was you need to get going. You need to pick something. You need to it's okay to adapt as you are recording and as you are trying to kind of finalize what that overall shape of your podcast is going to be. So I actually started calling my podcast The Sport of Business. I recorded my first 3 episodes under that name. Came to find out that name was already being utilized as a podcast. So kind of didn't practice what we preach there per se. Ended up on Sportcoats, and what we do is it's essentially a podcast that's fueled by kind of bridging the gap between sports and business. So I actually interview people who either played or were associated with a high level of athletics and have now moved into more of kind of a business profession in some capacity, small business owners, entrepreneurs, different things like that. So it's been a wonderful experience so far, and excited about kind of what the future has in store.
Yeah, I'm excited for you too, Will. So I wanted to give a nod to Stephen, the gentleman who I mentioned introduced me to podcasting. He's written an amazing book called Profitable Podcasting. It's available on Amazon. I highly recommend you take a listen. His podcast is called Onward Nation, as I mentioned. It's extremely popular. He's got listeners in 116 countries. And he, as of today, has recorded and launched 930 episodes. So if you're looking for some fantastic insights, I highly recommend his book and also listening to his podcast, Onward Nation. So, why podcasting in general? I mean, why would someone listen to your show? And I like to kind of organize the content of podcasts in three buckets: education, entertainment, and connection. So I'm going to dive into that a little bit deeper in just a little bit. But before we get into that, I have a question for you that I want you to think about. As you're working on and mapping out your podcast, pay attention to the podcast that you are listening to right now. And over the next week or a couple of weeks here, document what it is that you like about the podcast, what you're listening to. Why do you like it? Do you like the flow of the show? Do you like the conversation style of the hosts? Do you like that it's a solo cast, meaning there's just one person speaking to you? Or do you like that there's a variety of guests on the show? Do you like the length of the show? Do you prefer that it's structured, or do you rather have the conversation that's more free flow and freestyle? So start paying attention to what it is that you like, because this is likely kind of the style of show that you may want to replicate or emulate for yourself.
Yeah, I know that was certainly very important for me as I was trying to figure out what type of voice I wanted to have as a host of a podcast and different things like that. So it definitely is beneficial to kind of take that perspective as you're listening to your podcast, you know, whether it's daily or weekly, and just say, okay, what is it about this podcast that I really like? What stands out? What keeps you engaged, right? What are the kind of the components that continue to keep you engaged? I think that's super important.
Yeah, so make note of what is it about that podcast that you listen to that makes you want to listen to another episode from that same series.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so now I'm going to go into a little educational component as far as podcasting and why people want to listen. So actually the second most popular category, which I'll dive into that a little bit later too, is education. But education is a huge component with regards to podcasting. It's fantastic. Today's business climate has a strong emphasis on thought leadership, proving your expertise and adding value. In my opinion, podcasting is the easiest way to do that. Simply communicating in this message in a conversational form, it just makes it easy for you to showcase that expertise in the eye of your audience, and ultimately building relationships with your audience. So Onward Nation is an example, speaking to a wider audience. In addition, you can be very narrow and focused on your topic of conversation, such as Build a Better Agency, which is only speaking to marketing agencies. Another level of podcasting is the entertainment. So this is where there's a lot of storytelling that's coming in. So whether it's comical, thrilling, adventurous, this format is all about capturing your listeners' attention on a topic that ultimately resonates with them. So, and at the end of the day, you're building a relationship with your audience. And the last style or bucket that I like to classify podcasts in is ultimately to connect. So connecting with your audience is more about some sort of an emotional content that's being put out there. A number of podcasts have been produced to connect with their listeners through some emotional storytelling that applies to a very specific individual. I find that like the love stories and wedding stories, or a lot related to mental illness or AA type content. And these are individuals that are connecting because of a very similar experience, and helps them kind of cope with whatever scenario it is that they're looking for. At the end of the day, you don't have to be siloed in the type of content you're putting. So you can easily have a podcast that's educating and entertaining, or connecting, all of the above. So again, think about the style of content that you're producing, and have a plan in place to do that. So a little bit more about just why podcasting, and specifically for business. I mean, our assumption is that you're watching this webinar because you're interested in starting a podcast for your business. Well, there's some statistics out there that state that the majority of people that are listening to podcasts are very educated. So they have a bachelor's degree or higher. As I mentioned, the second most popular type of content is education related. And there's actually data that says podcast listeners are more likely to engage and follow companies and brands on social media. So there's a lot of value in having a podcast that's showcasing your expertise, educating your audience, your target audience on your skill set.
Yeah, and I'm just going to piggyback off that, Lori. I think one thing that a conversation that we have often, whether we're talking to people about podcasting or even with some of our own podcasting clients, is that, I think we have this impression in our head that if we're going to start a podcast, one thing that might hold us back from getting going is the fact that, no one's going to listen to it. We're not going to get all these great listeners of people that are going to tune in, and therefore it's not necessarily really worth it. And for us, it's really about shifting that mindset to saying it's not about getting a bunch of listeners. It's 100% about getting the right listeners. As long, your listenership can be a very small group, but if it's the right group that really needs, the type of information that you're talking about on your podcast, then, your podcast can still carry a lot of weight.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. So what equipment, what do we need to get started podcasting? I know, Will, you wanted to talk to some of these points here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, I think for us, we made it a priority early on, especially after you got podcasting, to actually make a podcast booth in our studio. We realize, of course, that is not an opportunity that everyone that is going to start a podcast or has a podcast is going to have. There are a lot of people that record at home, record, a variety of different places. We do certainly, though, think it's important that you have a really good microphone. So what we have actually shown here is kind of a Blue Yeti. Amazon has a number of great, expensive and inexpensive microphone options. Headphones are incredibly important, especially if you're doing, remote interviews with people. We typically record through Zoom, Skype, Zencaster, also great recording platforms that you can use if you're doing kind of virtual interviews. I know Lori and I both utilize those platforms, and it's worked out wonderfully for our podcast. When it comes to editing, as you can imagine, the editing of the show is certainly one of the biggest components to having a successful podcast. You want to make sure it's all about the user experience, right? So when someone tunes into your podcast, you want to make sure it flows nicely. You want to make sure you have a good intro music, and it really is kind of a seamless process into the actual interview itself as well. So when it comes to editing, Adobe Audition is where I would say what we prioritize. Audacity, GarageBand certainly, though, as well. Are great editing tools. And then lastly here, from a hosting perspective, Lori and I both are on Libsyn, and that, starts at $5 a month, but there are a number of other great hosting services as well, including SoundCloud, Podbean, Blueberry as well. So we'll make sure that we share some of these resources for those that are looking for some continued insight when it comes to the type of equipment that would allow them to be successful.
Sure. So Zencaster, what I like about that platform from a recording platform when you're recording remote episodes is that the audio files are recorded separately on the two different sources, and then you can have it automatically uploaded to your Dropbox account post recording. Excuse me. Audacity is a great free tool. So Will mentioned that we use Adobe Audition. That is a paid platform that you need to subscribe to, but Audacity does give you a lot of flexibility from a free standpoint. As far as your artwork goes, this is often an area I think a lot of people overlook and kind of rush. It is really important to have a visual that's going to stand out and capture someone's attention. So especially if someone's just perusing different podcasts to potentially listen to or subscribe to, it's the artwork that's going to capture someone's attention. So we've got Social Capital's artwork, or I call it the album cover, and that's basically like this is what the branding for the show is, and then you have per episode artwork. So on the left hand side, you see the Social Capital album cover, which has a picture of me. It's very simple, a lot of white space, and it's just got the name of the show there. And then that right hand image is which is the episode art. So I put the focus on my guest and have my guest headshot there, and then just the supporting small little bubble is my headshot. So Will, you want to talk about your podcast artwork?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's about trying to be creative. As you can see from both Lori and I's, they were both custom built kind of for our podcasting brand, if you will. So I think that you need to certainly spend some time doing it. I know I went through a number of different varieties of drafts to try to come to this conclusion. But as you said, it is important in the per episode to especially if it's an interview type podcast. At the end of the day, whoever it is that you're interviewing, they're going to be a huge part of whether or not they share the podcast and your information to their network as well. So you want to make them a big part of kind of that per episode artwork. That's our mindset, at least.
Yeah, and some notes as pointed on the left-hand side here. So make sure you have nice, vibrant colors or contrasting colors, things that are going to really pop. Definitely have some branding defined for yourself, your color palettes, your fonts. Keep it simple. You don't want to get too crazy busy because it's going to, these are very small images. But also some things to note when you are creating these, it should be a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning ultimately all your images should be square. The best practice is a minimum of 1400 by 1400 pixels, but it could recommend it up to 3000 by 3000 pixels. And you want to tell the story of what the show is about, really. But what's fun, have fun with this. Be creative and definitely make it something that resonates and connects with you, but more importantly, that's going to connect with your target listeners. As far as the audio goes for podcasting, it's extremely important to have this mapped out in advance and spend some time deciding what you want the introduction of your show to be. So what is it going to look like? How are you going to set the tone for what your show is about? You really want to have just a quick overview on what the show is about and how people can get in touch with you or follow you online is best practice. You want to keep it to, about like 10 seconds at the most, I'd say. Short and sweet, get to the point. And also consider the music. So we typically recommend using Pond 5 to find some audio files. In addition, YouTube has a lot of royalty-free audio that's available that you can use. Make sure you're not using anything that is going to open it up for any sort of copyright infringement. So you want to make sure you're legally using any sort of audio music that you found. Your outro is just kind of how you wrap up that show at the end of the day and just kind of repeat a lot of what was said in the intro. And then just thank your listeners for participating, and feel free to share, how they can get in touch with you again. And then as far as commercials go, so not every podcast does this, but especially if you're using this for business, something you might want to consider is pre-recording about a dozen different short little commercials or sound bites that you can embed in throughout your shows in the future. So it could be like, hey, thanks for listening. If you want to engage with us on social media, follow our Facebook page, blah, 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 blah. Or, hey, we've got this really interesting white paper about 10 ways to do whatever. Go to, website.com. So just a short little snippet that you can get in and plug in kind of halfway through the show. Anything to add on that, Will?
No, I think that's great. Again, I think it's another aspect of the podcast that you should just make sure that you don't just breeze through, because your intro is ultimately the first thing that someone hears when they tune in. And I know that was something that we took pretty seriously for my podcast, and it went really well. And I know that's one of the first things people say back to me is that they really like the intro. And I just had one of my buddies record it, but I definitely think it's important to make sure you take some time on this stuff.
Well, that's a good point, actually. I would say best practice is that you have another voice kind of recording and introducing you to the show. So you can use a friend, as you did. We hired talent for mine. So there's a lot of talent sources out there, voice123.com. And you can kind of listen to the different audio options. So if you want, someone with a nice Australian Aussie accent, I don't know if the right
Good day, mate.
Yeah, exactly. You can find
someone
that's got that. Which is kind of, again, fun, the style of the show that you're trying to go for. or you can go to fiverr.com and again, find a lot of voice talent. And you just have the script, you send it to them, they record it, and then you can plug that in. All right, so some final tips for you getting started. We'll just kind of crank through this, and then we're getting there to open up for questions. So really, at the end of the day, before you start doing anything, you need to know who it is that you want listening to you. Who is your target audience? And what type of topic or content that you're creating is going to connect and resonate with them. The next tip here is to really know and understand your distribution schedule, and have a plan for consistency. So right now my show is published on Mondays and Wednesdays, and my listeners have actually called me out when I didn't release an episode as initially planned. You know, I had people going, "Hey, is everything okay? I was expecting a show out there." So it's extremely important to be consistent with the distribution of your shows. I am a fan of pushing content out on Mondays because oftentimes, and granted, in today's stay-at-home world, this might have changed, and I should probably dive into looking at that a little bit. But historically, Mondays were a really good day for people to just download a bunch of episodes to their smartphones, and then they would listen to the series throughout the course of the week that they downloaded.
This is also probably a good time to remind people of the backlog, and it is incredibly important to know what day of the week and how often you will be releasing your podcast. And then on top of that as well, we always encourage people to have kind of a backlog of 5 or 6 episodes. So, you know, let's say they're not able to record in a certain week, or they need to take a couple of weeks off from recording, they still have that backlog built up to maintain a very consistent schedule. So just kind of a quick reminder.
Yeah, so that's actually tip number 3, is to have multiple episodes recorded in advance, especially in advance of launching. And so, for example, you know, we just launched his show, but he actually he has a bucket of pre-recorded episodes ready to go. My show, I said I've recorded 230, but I think we just published episode number like 216 or something like that. So I have content that is good through June, actually, that can be published. So I could stop recording right now if I wanted to. This only works if you are publishing evergreen content. If you're going to have a podcast that is time-sensitive information, so for example, you know, the daily news or stuff related to current events in the world, such as COVID-19, then it's going to be a little bit different process as far as having, you know, you can't really pre-record stuff not knowing what's going to happen. If you are focusing on having more of that real-time conversation in your podcast, you could still have some evergreen content pre-recorded, so that in the event you weren't able to get a live show out on schedule, you had some filler or buffer available to you. The next tip is you've got to promote it. So no different than the website world. You know, people don't know if you build it, they will come is not true. So maximize social media and the tools ahead of you. So what's awesome about podcasting is it sets the tone to have a ridiculous amount of content that you can share across multiple channels. So you've got the audio. I highly recommend you transcribe that audio. There's a lot of tools out there to do that automatically. We use otter.ai. There's a designated amount of like free transcription. It's not perfect, but it does a decent enough job. You still have to review it and make some tweaks. But then you can convert that into show notes or blog posts. And then you pull, you know, chunks of information out of that and create social media posts and, you know, blast it all over social media. If you have a guest on your show, I highly recommend you tag that individual. Use hashtags to just, you know, kind of let the content go further than it would without it. So definitely take advantage of the different ways that you can distribute your content. We also promote our podcasts in our monthly newsletter to our clients and our network as well. Another tip that I have found a significant amount of value in is to join some communities online of other podcasters. There's a great group called Podcast Movement, where you can literally ask any question about podcasting and you're going to get a ton of fantastic, valuable insights from those that have been doing it for a while. If you're a female podcaster, there's a group that I belong to called She Podcasts. And again, a lot of fantastic content is made available, and just a great network. And it's also a great place to find guests for your show. My last tip is to just do it. I mean, as I said, I was twiddling my thumbs on just being on the show initially with Steven on his Onward Nation podcast. But once I got over that fear, I'm really grateful I did, because here I am 3 years later, still podcasting. And I think, Will, you had a similar scenario too. You just kind of sat there like, I want to do this. And
Yes, there's no question that took some time, right, to kind of build up that courage and ask people to be on your show, and then finally do all the bits and pieces that need to be done up front. But I tell you what, it's a great feeling to have it live and launched. And I know for me, it's a great opportunity to, become a better listener, and also, hear some great stories and hear some great insight that I think people will find really valuable. And so far it's been an awesome experience. But you have to just get up and you have to get her going.
Yep, totally. Fantastic. Love it. So in summary, we talked about why podcasting. We really covered some of the equipment and some of the resources that you need to get started. And then we wrapped it up with some tips. So before we dive into questions, just a friendly reminder that we've got, this is going to be every Friday. We've got this webinar going. And as long as Will and I have fantastic content to share with you, we have tons of topics to cover. But we are really interested in catering to what is of interest to you. So if you want to, comment right now or chat and spit out some ideas as far as what would you like to see us sharing and educating you on, we can definitely put some information together for you. We invite you to join us next week for SEO basics, and then on the 24th for how to use hashtags. All right, let's open it up for questions.